Last time, we explored the grand start to making the 7th entry in the Final Fantasy series, starting out on the SNES with a setting in New York City, before being moved to the Nintendo 64 disk drive with an idea to make the series in 3D, but ultimately failed to work on the console due to several technical limitations. But with the coming of the PlayStation, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi found a platform that could make him and his team at Squaresoft the dream game that they wanted all along. Going through several iterations of the story, including changing back to a fantasy setting, relationships including those between Sephiroth and Aerith being siblings at one point, and a heated debate on who should die at the crux of the game's story. But with the story built, the true test of the platform switch was about to come to fold, with development in full force now on the Sony PlayStation. So today on Gaming History, we shall explore in the second part the history and beta unused content of Final Fantasy VII. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button too, to further support us and keep creating new videos. Knowing that they were making a 3-dimensional game from the get-go while the scripting was being finalized, the challenge came about how to render the game in the 3rd dimension. While the Nintendo 64 definitely provided the polygons needed in shaping a fully 3D environment, the PlayStation had a much tougher time doing that with a much lower polygon count. In order to continue using polygons, the team started leaning towards the idea of using 2D sprites against a 3D background. It would provide not just detailed characters, but as well still can create a cinematic game in combination with the environment, an approach games like Xenogears were taking, which were in concurrent development at Squaresoft. However, head staff, including the game's director Yoshinori Kitase, vetoed the idea. The ambition behind this entry was to make it more of a cinematic game, and felt that they wouldn't be able to make a realistic drama with 2D sprites. While the team wasn't thrilled, including the game's art director Yusuke Naora, who felt his job was now at risk, as all he knew up to then was drawing in 2D, the team ultimately agreed. And so Naora and the team took up CG training sessions to learn on how to develop with 3D visuals with cinematics in mind. This including learning and taking duties of modeling and animation of 3D characters, texturing, creating environments, and various visual effects. But the problem still stood. How do you render a fully 3D RPG on the underpowered PlayStation? As with the troubles of how to solve Resident Evil's technical problems, the answer was clear. Look to the foreign game Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark used what are known as pre-rendered backgrounds, a set of flat images with a realistic environment rendered to them, starting with a mesh layer to map out where the character could walk and the camera set over it, along with a flat image that would be layered on top of it, with the 3D character walking in front of that image to make it look like as if they are walking in that very environment. Therefore, rather than have 2D characters against 3D, it was 3D characters against a 2D background to solve the polygonal issue. But even then, Sakaguchi felt that there was a need to use 2 different models between field and battles. A field model, which would be reflective of 2D Final Fantasy games, keeping a more chibi or super deformed model, a decision Sakaguchi felt was necessary, as the larger proportions of the head would better convey emotions than try to see it on a face of a more realistic model. As a result, various expressions were being designed for the characters to display on the field, especially with their eyes, including blinking animations, some that even went unused, like 3 of Cloud's expressions, with one that included a more tired expression and one that was a more happier out of character one. Plans even went as far as to even include mouths, but ultimately weren't used until the PC version. On the flip side, battles would have realistic models that would convey the art style of Tetsuya Nomura, perfect for swinging weapons without stabbing their larger deformed heads. And so, with the art style and graphics decided on, the team purchased high-powered Silicon Graphics Onyx supercomputers along with various related software and gear, a cost that would rack up to $21 million US. But the key to all this was that the game was to be cinematic. During the scripting stages of the game, storyboards were being drawn up for such details. Designer Tetsuya Nomura had already been been deeply involved in the creative process and even came up with the limit break system, was drawing up on how each of these limit breaks would even look. This even extended to drawing the various camera angles that would go into performing attacks in battle, casting magic, and even various unique camera angles that summons would have. But outside of battle, because the game's field scenes were going to be using a fixed camera angle against a pre-rendered background, it would make cinematic and moving camera angles an impossibility. But director Yoshinori Kitase was hell-bent on taking that story and making it work in a highly cinematic fashion. Much like another acclaimed director in the industry, Kitase was a major film buff and wanted to bridge storytelling between video games and films. For this, the idea was to use full motion videos, or FMVs for short, an industry staple at the time, to show pre-recorded movie files within a game to better tell a story in a more cinematic fashion. With disc technology, this was indeed a possibility on the PlayStation. For that, Squaresoft opened a new subsidiary to develop highly polished FMVs using computer graphics called Visual Works. While Visual Works would develop an initial concept for the FMV, utilizing a storyboard with simple polygons in place, the actual FMVs were made with a team of internationally hired talents from North America and Japan, utilizing major Hollywood artists that worked on properties including Jurassic Park, Terminator, and even Star Wars. And so a whopping 40 hours of FMV cutscenes were made for the game, pushing the PlayStation's disk space so much the game now required 3 discs to run on. Once again, a feat that only became doable now thanks to the PlayStation's ability to allow for switching discs. But in addition to that, another sort of FMV cutscenes were being made, whereby the gameplay would seamlessly transition from in-game to an FMV cutscene, keeping the chibi models to use for such scenes, the only compromise possible to do in-field cinematic cutscenes as a result. And this was all done with Sakaguchi's iron-fisted rule that it had to run without any load times. Otherwise, a load time would ruin the transition to a seamless FMV cutscene. But aside from these, the game was getting many other further polishes in terms of building a more cinematic experience, including working with a motion specialist to get animations just right, making real-time effects over what were pre-rendered backgrounds to give the environment more life, hand-drawn at times even, to get it just right, and on top of that, trying to make those varied backgrounds as detailed as possible. A daunting task, as director Kitase would describe, this being with how detailed they had to be to the point of going through several revisions to get their final versions, such as this one from the early game during the bombing mission, where it was flat initially, but given the real-time effect of glowing lights by the end, let alone the mesh for it also getting larger too by the final game. And then there's the elevator in this area, having its VFX altered altogether by adding floor numbers to it by the end, as well as some of the lights just not being there anymore. The tower area that followed even had environmental changes done, whereby on the top, the grates were removed, a brick wall had a panel covering it, and the dome was hollowed out. The area with the ladders received a much greater environmental change, with entire platforms removed on the bottom right here, these hanging bits off the top here, and in general numerous wires, pipes, and differing wall textures added all over. Though it appears that this version may have been reutilized for the Sector 5 reactor later on, even though that did receive some changes too by the end, including different lighting and the removal of that bottom platform too. The mesh especially changed heavily. While it was a straightforward walk originally, it was changed to cloud jumping around a lot and actually using the ladder too, even in the Sector 5 version. Top that off with several of the backgrounds simply going unused, including one for a northern crater, an empty cargo ship, this hill one called Trap, and even ones like this Great Glacier having this tall unused background that were even seen in previews of the game. As well, there were transitional backgrounds that would lead into an FMV cutscene like this one called Junmon, which is believed to be made as the transitional background into the Sapphire Weapon cutscene in Junon, or even one called XMV Test that leads to the scene in the livestream, or Falpi, which would lead to the FMV of President Rufus being taken down. And sometimes there were even areas of final pre-renders that just weren't used, like this one in the Sleeping Forest that has this unused cave here on the right side that one was to get to via climbing this vine, or Stranger being at the bottom of this prison well that has this red man hidden here, which in the final game all you see is a treasure chest here, the purpose of which is unknown, but this very area was an area that was being known to test battle elements too, such as this test monster called Test Zero that was fought here, Even in the final Japanese release of the game, to further test and debug the game, numerous test rooms were made featuring the game's cast that can be spoken to do everything from exploring various areas of the game, watching any cutscenes, getting various items such as all the materia, and even carrying over your stats into a new game, kind of like a developer's only New Game Plus. While the limit break element was planned and added to the development of the battle system, numerous aspects of the system were still in the works. While in most previous games, each character had their own personal skills that they would learn as they level up. But this time, it was decided that battles wouldn't be about the individual's innate skills. This is where the creation of Materias came in. Spherical items that the characters would equip to use different abilities, whether it be magics, buffs, or even summons. Any character could equip them, and how battles flowed would change depending on the combination with said character used. Nomura proposed to simply call them spheres, but Sakaguchi suggested the name Materia, as it would better resonate with people, including elementary school kids. And there were many made, some that even went unused, including the booster materia, which is one that is theorized to have boosted your ability points on a materia when attached to that very materia. Then there are some materias that teach singular or dual skills that were combined with others to make a more useful materia. The first one being the law materia, which teaches guild toss, something that is part of the throw materia in the final game, which also lets you throw weapons. There is also the M barrier materia that teaches the magic barrier command, and also there is the reflect materia that will teach reflect and wall, all of which were grouped together to make the barrier materia that teaches all 4 skills. An interesting one is the reflect absorb materia, which is speculated as a countermeasure to enemies who use reflect, basically dispel, which was a part of the destruct materia by the final game. And like with other Final Fantasy games, elements such as fire, thunder, ice, and many more were included in a weakness and resistance system. 9 of them in total, in fact. However, a 10th one was being planned too. It was something the developers even spoke about in interviews about a 10th element, but was eventually dummied out. However, traces of it stayed into the final game, with Ultimate Weapon's Ultima Beam still being mapped to it. However, the 10th element does nothing, despite being attached to it, but at one point, it is possible that this existed to be resisted by an item or ability that they were planning against Ultimate Weapon, which with that, enemies were well in the planning to be faced, many of which also saw them being changed and altered. For example, the Hochu and the Tonberry enemies that can only be fought at the battle square were also intended to appear elsewhere, with Hochu in the Ancient Forest and the Tonberry in the Whirlwind Maze and Northern Crater. Along with enemies comes hidden abilities that didn't make it to the final game, such as the Dual Horns ability that cost a whopping 64,535 MP to use. It targets a random friend or foe and does no damage. Likely a dummied out skill with MP set too high for it to use without actually removing it completely and breaking the game. The other is the Acrophes, which has a nearly unused skill called Isogen Smog that damages the party and casts darkness. Problem is that the party already has to be entirely under the effect of darkness for it to even use it. But one aspect the series is best known for is the music. The music of this series up to this point was solely composed by the genius of Nobuo Uematsu and was working on the 7th entry too. Originally, Uematsu wanted to take advantage of the PlayStation's capabilities of producing CD quality audio and have music with vocal performances too. This, however, had to be scrapped due to how it would make loading times between areas take much longer due to the bigger audio files that it would have to load, and thus stuck to the console's own internal sound sequencer to produce music much as he had with previous Final Fantasy games. Granted, the difference this time being that the PlayStation offered a whopping 24 channels of audio to work with, as opposed to the SNES, which only offered 8. As a result, Uematsu was able to approach this like he was approaching a movie score, making it better reflect the story being told. As such, Uematsu was shown scenes from the game and told to make said tracks for them, starting with the bombing mission as the beginning, but as well as making some very defining tracks meant for specific scenes to better convey the emotion of said scenes, including Aerith's death, with his intention being for it to feel sad but beautiful, and what might be his magnum opus, One Winged Angel. While simply stuck using the PlayStation's internal sound sequencer, he used a large number of high quality digitized vocals in making this. The first game ever to do so, and fitting for the game's final battle. Next time, as development was in full steam ahead, the game's deadline was soon approaching and preparing for launch in Japan and soon North America, with differing demos releasing in both regions, a nightmare localization that would create a very over-the-top and questionable script, and to top that off, a serious challenge from their publisher Sony in the West to cut the entirety of the Honeybee in, despite already trying to tone it down internally. So for this last part, make sure to hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Final Fantasy and other games gaming history and cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what was your favorite cut element. So everyone, thank you for watching.